It's draft day in Philadelphia, and everything around the Philadelphia Eagles feels calculated, deliberate, and honestly a little bit revealing if you're paying close attention. Holding 8 total selections in the 2026 NFL Draft and sitting at number 23 overall tonight, this front office once again finds itself in a position where the move they make isn't just about today, it's about shaping the next version of this roster before problems even appear. And if there's one consistent theme coming from multiple league voices, it's this. Don't expect the Eagles to react. Expect them to anticipate. You look at what experts like Mel Kiper Jr. and Field Yates are saying, and it becomes pretty clear that Howie Roseman is once again thinking 2 steps ahead. This isn't a franchise that waits for a weakness to become obvious. They attack it early, quietly, and efficiently, and right now, the biggest signal points directly to the offensive line. Even with Lane Johnson confirming he's back for 2026, there's a growing sense that the Eagles are preparing for what comes next. That's where names like Blake Miller start to make a lot of sense. A massive presence at 6'6" and over 300 pounds. With more than 50 college starts and elite consistency, Miller isn't just a safe pick, he's a strategic one. Multiple analysts highlight his ability to step into a long-term role, potentially becoming the successor at right tackle without forcing the issue immediately. And that's classic Philadelphia. Build now for stability later. But here's where things get interesting, because Miller isn't the only path. There's also Max Ahanekor, a much rawer prospect, someone who only started playing football recently but carries enormous upside. Analysts describe him as a long-term investment, the kind of player who could become a star if developed properly within the Eagles system. It's a risk, but one that fits perfectly with a team confident in its coaching and development pipeline. Then you have Caleb Lomu, another versatile option. He's younger, adaptable, and already working on switching sides of the line, with some believing he could even slide inside if needed. That kind of flexibility has always been valuable in Philadelphia, especially for a roster that prioritizes depth and adaptability in the trenches. But don't lock yourself into thinking this is only about offensive line help. There are subtle hints pointing elsewhere too. At wide receiver, Denzel Boston stands out as a completely different type of weapon. Big, physical, and highly productive in the red zone, he brings something unique to the offense. A true boundary presence who can dominate in scoring situations. And then there's Omar Cooper Jr., whose combination of strength, speed, and body control could make his transition to the NFL surprisingly smooth. And if the Eagles decide to shift focus defensively, Keldrick Faulk enters the conversation. With questions about pass rush depth, adding another edge presence could signal a return to the dominant defensive identity this team has leaned on in the past. There's even the possibility of something more aggressive. A potential trade-up scenario involving Caden Proctor has been floated, suggesting the Eagles could jump from number 23 to number 15 to secure a top-tier offensive tackle before other teams make their move. If that happens, it would confirm that Philadelphia isn't just thinking ahead. They're willing to act decisively to control the board. And quietly, another intriguing name appears in the mix, Kenyon Sadiq. A tight end with pass-catching ability, he represents a different kind of need, one tied to offensive evolution. If the Eagles are looking for a long-term solution at that position, this could be the kind of unexpected move that reshapes how the offense operates moving forward. So when you step back and look at the full picture, this isn't just about pick number 23. It's about identity. It's about whether the Eagles double down on their foundation in the trenches, take a swing on upside, or introduce a new dimension to the offense or defense. Because whatever happens tonight, it's not random. It's part of a pattern we've seen before, one where Philadelphia positions itself ahead of the curve while everyone else is still reacting. And that brings the real question to you. If you're in that draft room right now, do you stick with the safe, long-term offensive line plan, or take a bigger swing on a playmaker or high upside talent that could change the team in a different way? And that's exactly where the tension inside this decision really starts to build, because once you accept that Philadelphia is always thinking ahead, you also have to accept that they're comfortable making moves that don't immediately satisfy the loudest needs. If the Eagles stay at number 23, the expectation around the league is still heavily leaning toward the offensive line, and not by accident. The idea of placing a young tackle behind Lane Johnson for a year, allowing him to learn, adjust, and develop without pressure fits perfectly into how this organization has sustained success in the trenches. It's not just about replacing a legend, it's about making sure there's no drop-off when that transition eventually happens. That's why someone like Blake Miller continues to feel like the most Eagles pick of the group. Reliable, experienced, technically sound, and already tested at a high level, he represents stability. And stability is something this front office values more than flash when it comes to protecting the quarterback and controlling the line of scrimmage. But here's the twist. Philadelphia doesn't always follow the obvious path, even when it makes perfect sense. Because if they believe the ceiling is higher elsewhere, they won't hesitate to pivot. That's where prospects like Max Ahienachor come back into focus. He's not the polished option. He's not the immediate answer. But in terms of raw potential, he might be one of the most intriguing players in this entire class. And for a team that has the luxury of patience, that kind of upside becomes incredibly tempting. The same logic applies to Caleb Lomu. His versatility alone could earn him a role early, even if he's not locked into a single position yet. In a system like Philadelphia's, where adaptability across the offensive line is crucial, that flexibility could fast track his development while still serving a long-term purpose. Now shift the lens for a moment, because this is where things could really surprise people. If the Eagles feel that the offensive line depth is already in a manageable place, don't be shocked if they look at adding a true offensive weapon. Denzel Boston brings a physical presence that can change how defenses behave in the red zone. He's the kind of receiver that forces mismatches simply by stepping onto the field, and when you pair that with an already dynamic offense, you start to see how one piece can elevate everything else. Then there's Omar Cooper Jr., who offers a more balanced skill set, someone who can contribute across multiple areas right away. His transition to the NFL is expected to be smooth, and that kind of immediate impact can sometimes outweigh long-term projection, depending on how the board falls. Defensively, the conversation doesn't lose any intensity either. Keldrick Faulk represents an opportunity to reinforce the pass rush, something that has been a defining strength of this team in its best moments. If the Eagles feel like they need to re-establish that dominance up front, this kind of pick would send a very clear message about their priorities. And then there's the scenario that could change everything in an instant, the trade-up. If Howie Roseman sees a run on offensive tackles beginning earlier than expected, the move for Caden Proctor suddenly becomes very real. Jumping up to secure a player they believe is a tier above the rest wouldn't just be aggressive, it would be calculated. It would mean the Eagles identified their guy and refused to let the opportunity slip away. And that's the key to understanding all of this. Every name being discussed isn't just about talent, it's about timing, value, and long-term vision. Philadelphia doesn't draft in isolation, they draft with the next 2, 3, even 4 seasons in mind. Even the mention of Kenyon Sadiq quietly reinforces that idea. A tight end with receiving ability might not be the headline move tonight, but it could end up being one of the most impactful decisions when you look back a couple of years from now, especially if the offense evolves in a way that demands more versatility at that position. So as the clock gets closer and the board starts to take shape, just remember, what feels like a surprise to the outside world is often exactly what the Eagles planned all along. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Are you trusting the front office to stick with the long-term blueprint in the trenches, or do you want to see them take a bold swing and add a playmaker or high-upside talent that could shift the direction of this team right away? And if you had to choose, which name would you call when that pick comes in? And that decision, more than anything, is what's going to define how this entire draft class is remembered a few years from now. Because whether it's building quietly in the trenches or making a move that grabs headlines, the Philadelphia Eagles are positioning themselves to stay competitive, not just for this season, but for the long run. If they go offensive line, it's a continuation of a philosophy that has kept this team stable through multiple roster transitions. It's the understanding that games are still won at the line of scrimmage and that protecting your quarterback while controlling tempo is non-negotiable. A player like Blake Miller or even a higher upside option like Max Ahienachor wouldn't just fill a future gap, they would extend a legacy that's been central to the team's identity. But if they pivot, if they decide that now is the moment to inject something different into the roster, then we could be looking at a shift in how this offense or defense evolves. Adding a receiver like Denzel Boston changes spacing, changes red zone dynamics, and potentially gives the quarterback another dimension to work with. Going after a defender like Keldrick Faulk sends a message that pressure and disruption are once again top priorities. And don't forget, the possibility of a bold move is always there. Howie Roseman has built a reputation on staying unpredictable when it matters most. If there's a player like Caden Proctor that they truly believe in, the cost to move up might not be a barrier. It might be part of the plan. plan. What makes this moment so fascinating is that every option feels justified. There's no panic here, no desperation, just choices. Strategic, calculated choices that will shape the next phase of this team, and that's why this pick carries so much weight. Not because it has to fix something immediately, but because it reflects exactly how the Eagles see themselves, not just today, but in the seasons ahead. So now, as everything unfolds and the board starts to fall into place, it all comes down to execution. One decision, one name, one direction. And the moment that pick is finally announced, everything we've been breaking down instantly shifts from speculation to reality. That's when the real evaluation begins, not just of the player, but of the strategy behind the decision. Because if there's one thing we've learned over the years, it's that the Philadelphia Eagles rarely make isolated moves. Every selection connects to something bigger, whether it's protecting the future of the offensive line, adding another dimension to the offense, or reinforcing a defensive identity. There's always a chain reaction that follows. If it's a name like Blake Miller, the conversation immediately turns to succession planning and stability. If it's a higher upside prospect like Max Ahiana-Kor, then it becomes about patience and development. And if they surprise everyone with a skill player or defensive piece, then we're suddenly talking about how this roster might evolve faster than expected. That's the beauty of this moment. One decision opens multiple paths, and Philadelphia has put itself in position to benefit from whichever direction they choose. And don't lose sight of this either. This is just the beginning. With multiple picks still ahead, the Eagles have the flexibility to adjust, to double down on a position, or to balance out the class depending on how the board falls. What happens at number 23 sets the tone, but it doesn't define the entire story. It's the first move in what could be a very calculated sequence. So stay locked in, because as soon as that name is called, we'll break it all down. What it means, why it happened, and what comes next for this team. And as the draft continues to unfold beyond that first selection, this is where the real depth of the Philadelphia Eagles strategy starts to reveal itself. Because what happens after the first round is often where championship caliber rosters are truly built, and this front office understands that better than most. With 8 total picks in hand, Philadelphia isn't just aiming for one impact player. They're looking to stack value across multiple positions. That's where the earlier decision becomes even more important. If they address the offensive line early, they now have the flexibility to explore weapons, defensive reinforcements, or even developmental prospects who can grow into key roles over time. If they went in a different direction in round 1, then expect them to circle back and reinforce the trenches quickly. This is where names that didn't go in the first round could suddenly come back into play in a different context. Players with upside, versatility, or specific traits that fit the system start to become even more valuable on day 2 and day 3. And historically, this is where Howie Roseman has separated himself, finding contributors beyond the spotlight picks. You start thinking about roster construction as a whole. Depth on the offensive line isn't just about 5 starters. It's about having options when injuries hit, about maintaining consistency no matter who steps in. The same applies across the roster. Wide receivers who can rotate in and create mismatches. Defensive linemen who keep the pass rush fresh deep into games. Tight ends who expand what the offense can do. And that brings us back to one of the most underrated